This is not my line. This is her line. Her line. It's Fight Night Bitches.
BALCO, when you started this, there was obviously no intention of where it would end up going. We're connected, but you teamed up with a bodybuilding chemist, and you guys created. Let me see if I can say this. The short word is the clear tetrahydrogesterone.
Pretty good, tetrahydrogesterone. Yes.
Oh, okay. Pretty. I mean, I wrote it phonetically.
THG, the clear.
THG, the clear. The clear. Now, that is obviously it's undetectable. I know that you were not planning on going down a path of maybe, doing dirty things, but how did you go from becoming a musician to starting this sports nutrition center to becoming the most well-known PEDs distributor / you're the guy to go to get that edge? How did that happen, Victor?
Well, okay,
you just don't wake up one day and say, I want to be the Adolf Hitler of sports.
No, let's put it into perspective. BALCO started in 1984.
Yeah.
So I worked with many, many world-class athletes in many sports. I went to the Olympics in 1988. I had done blood testing and provided supplementation to 25 athletes that brought back 15 medals from Seoul. Now, the total medal count was 97, so somewhere close to 20% of the medals that were won by the U.S. at the time. And there was actually an article that was on the front page of the sports of the San Francisco Examiner. That used to be the Sunday edition of the Chronicle here. And it was called Getting Athletes in Tune.
Okay.
And so for 16 years, I was completely above board. There was no type of performance-enhancing drugs involved. I had helped athletes win Super Bowl championships, and I worked with many tennis players and track and field athletes and so on. And then that's when in 1999, actually, at the end of the year, I met Patrick Arnold at the Mr. Olympia in Las Vegas, the expo that they had there. And he told me that he had some stuff that seemed to help athletes recover. He didn't tell me that it was an anabolic steroid named norbolethone. And actually the bottle that I got from him, I bought for $150. That's what it was called, was Stuff. S-T-U-F.
Okay, Victor. So when you read a bottle that says Stuff, it's not even an acronym. That didn't raise any red flags.
I knew he was a chemist.
No, don't do this.
I knew he was a chemist, and he didn't tell me what it was. I learned later. And then, of course, there was called Nor Stuff, and then the other was called Trend Stuff, which the THG was similar in structure to an anabolic steroid, Trembolone. And then there was another third one as well. I never gave it to any athletes, although I took it myself. But what happened was I had the ability, because I owned a clinical laboratory, to do testing on urine samples for all of the performance-enhancing anabolic steroids at the time. And so I took it myself, and I did what they call a suppression test. That means I took it, and then the next day and the next day and the next day I collected urine, and I could see that it suppressed the androgen. It had an affinity for the androgen receptors, and it was lowering my own testosterone level. That's when the first clue came that this had anabolic properties. But it was undetectable.
How did you, was this injectable in your
No, it was oral.
What? Oh,
no, it was oral.
Okay.
You actually took an eyedropper and put it inside the bottle, and then you put a couple of drops under your tongue, but you would measure out an amount. And then I also developed something called the cream, and at the time I was already 47 years old. No, by that time I was, let's see, so I was 50 in 2000, so I was 49, 50 years old, and I knew that this was undetectable, but if it saturated the receptor and reduced your own testosterone level, then that would become a red flag for the testers. So I had gotten a testosterone prescription, had my blood tested, and got a prescription for testosterone cream. And so So the protocol that I created was they would take the clear, which was the THG on Monday, the cream on Tuesday to bring back the testosterone level to normal, again on Wednesday with the clear and the cream on Thursday, and then go off on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So it was a 4-day-a-week protocol, and there was a month supply. And at the same time, I was testing everybody's blood and looking at liver enzymes and cholesterol fractions and, you know, any of the parameters that mean that it would be causing adverse health effects. So I made everybody test, and they used to call it Victor's short leash, because if they didn't do the blood test to make sure that we didn't have adverse health effects, then that would be the last batch that they got. So anyway, I was trying to do what most of these athletes were already doing, which was using steroids and other growth hormone and EPO and different drugs, but I was trying to do it in a more safe and effective manner. Initially, I acquired the rights to this technology. It was called an inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectrometer, about the size of a pickup truck. Cost
Wait, can you say that a little slower? That had so many syllables, and it sounded like it has 30 letters in it.
ICP spectrometer, but the acronym, it's an ICP-AES, inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectrometer. And eventually I learned how to operate the machine, and we got all the licenses and hired a team of doctors. And of course, that was the BALCO laboratories that developed thereafter, that had a long history working with world-class athletes.
Well, you went down a very slippery slope. You have no medical background at all, correct? You never, were you good in science and chemistry?
In Sports Illustrated, they called me an autodidact. That just means somebody who's self-taught.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that I didn't hire a lot of very smart people, MDs, PhDs, and learn from them. And actually, the medical director in 1984, when I first founded BALCO, I found him in the Yellow Pages. And
hold on.
He was a neurosurgeon, and he was attending Stanford at the time, and he was originally from South Africa. And he took me down to the Lane Medical Library at Stanford University and helped me get a library card. And then this is when computers first came out. You know, the PC in the early 80s, but in 1984, we went to a trade show and bought a clone computer, and the hard drive at the time was 5 megabyte.
5?
5 mega. This is when they first came out, and you had the scratchy telephone connection.
Yeah.
And there were 2 computer monitors at the time. This is before, you know, Apple came out with that boxy computer. And so he taught me how to tap into the National Library of Medicine. And you get this scratchy telephone line, and I would tap in, and then I would type in. There were 2 types of monitors, amber and green, and that was it. We had an amber, and all you had was characters. There was no graphics. But I would type in keywords like zinc and muscle strength, or copper and connective tissue, or magnesium and muscle cramps. And I would do these searches, and I would find these references. And then I spent 60, 70 hours a week crawling around on my hands and knees at the Lane Medical Library at Stanford, teaching myself all about mineral and trace element metabolism. And then right away, they've called it Victor's Knack. The first thing I did in 1985 was hook up with a coach, a track coach named Bill Dillinger. He was the United States Olympic track coach for the Olympic Games in Los Angeles in 1984. I flew up to the University of Oregon, and one of his star athletes at the time was Alberto Salazar, who was the world record holder in the marathon and had won the New York City Marathon 2 or 3 years in a row. And I started working with him. And thereafter, I started working with some of the San Francisco 49ers. And then eventually I met Bill Romanowski, who he'd already left the Niners after they'd won a Super Bowl or 2 and went to Philadelphia. And that's where he was at when I started working with him. And then he went to Denver, and I actually went to the training camp in 1997 and 98 and collected blood on all the entire team, including John Elway and Terrell Davis and Steve Atwater and Shannon Sharp and all the stars. And long story short, they won back-to-back Super Bowls. And I had provided blood testing and then nutritional supplementation all the way from training camp. There was 85 guys until they whittled the team down to whatever it is, 53, and then they won the Super Bowl, and then they won the Super Bowl again. And thereafter, I worked with other teams like Dan Marino and the Miami Dolphins in the 80s. I had a very successful period of time and worked with over 250 NFL players in the 1990s. I'd met a guy who was with, at that time, it was called TAC, the Athletic Congress. Later, it's now called United States Track and Field. And he was at the Olympics in '88, and I met him again in 1992 at the Track and Field Championships in New Orleans. And afterwards, he called me up and he said, "Hey, your boy tested positive." I said, "What do you mean?" And he talked about one of the shot putters that I was working with had tested positive for Dianabol. "Were you taking Dianabol?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I just got told that you tested positive."
Oh.
And he goes, "Oh my God, my wife, she's going to kill me. I'm going to have to get a job now." You know.
That's what he was worried about.
A few days later, this guy, he called me back and said, "Listen, I had a meeting. One of the elder statesmen at TAC or USA Track and Field passed away, and some of the guys got together and they decided there were 5 positive drug tests. One of them was a 400-meter hurdler. Another one was a high jumper. And one of them was a shot putter. He was on the '88 Olympic team." And he said, "Listen, they've decided that they're going to go ahead and sweep this under the rug, so tell your boy he's off the hook."
Oh my God.
Well, this is when I learned at the very highest level, all the way to people at the Olympic Games, and I had direct knowledge that they were covering up positive drug tests. And I don't want to say too much about, like television networks that broadcast and on down, and who it is that actually, controls what positive test results come out and which ones don't. And then I learned that other very, very famous track and field athletes at the '88 Olympics, including the most famous sister-in-laws who were on the front cover of Time magazine and so on, had also tested positive, but this had all been covered up. This kind of changed my approach, and I thought, listen, and of course it was a mistake to think this, but my rationale was, it's not cheating if everyone's doing it. And if you have knowledge that, I wouldn't say everyone, that's a bad word to use, but majority. Let's say the overwhelming majority of elite athletes at the Olympic Games level were using some sort of performance-enhancing substances, at least during that year before the actual Olympic Games occurred. And that kind of made me think, well, this is undetectable. It's not, it's not on the list. No one knows about this.
Well, think about this.
Eventually, I did start giving people growth hormone and EPO and a whole array of drugs. And as you know, then this went on to, in 2000 in Sydney, Australia, I went to the Olympics there, the Drive for 5, she was on all the magazine covers and won 5 medals and so on. But eventually, yes, I was giving performance-enhancing substances to world-class athletes. And, it's come out now that, as an example, in 1988, I don't know if you saw that special called 979. It's a part of the 30-30 series.
I saw part of it. Yeah.
Anyway, they linked 8 of the 9 finalists in the 100 meters together, along with Ben Johnson, who tested positive, as all using performance-enhancing drugs. So it's very rampant. It's just a part of the culture. Athletes, what I have learned is that they're going to do what they have to do in order to be competitive. And if they believe that their competition is doing stuff, then it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and they're going to do what they have to do to try to win.
You were involved in the '88 Olympics. Imagine the Olympics before that, and then the Olympics before that, how prevalent steroid use, PEDs were, and you just happen to kind of fall into it. And then you really went down that rabbit hole, Victor.
But let's put this into perspective. They didn't even have out-of-competition random drug testing until 1990. So at the Olympic Games, when I went, they would test you at the games, but all they would do is take drugs for a year, and then go to the trials and taper off 2-3 weeks ahead of time, and then test negative and then go on to the Olympics. But when you're using growth hormone, EPO, anabolic steroids, in conjunction with an intense weight training program, those gains are going to carry over months and months later. So I knew that, many of these athletes, and some, not only were they using drugs, but when they tested positive, their results were being covered up. So they started random testing in 1990. And of course, thereafter, I knew that it was very easy to circumvent and the testing. And that's what it was. It was really a competition, not only amongst the athletes, but against those who had some of the best chemists in the world.
So these are some of the athletes. I'm going to name them all. Let's see if they're actually right. Major League Baseball players, of course, Barry Bonds. He was indicted. Benito Santiago, Jeremy Giambi, Bobby Estalella, Amando Rios, sprinters, Dwayne Chambers, Marion Jones, Tim Montgomery, Raymond J. Smith, Zana Block, is that right?
Block.
Zana Block.
Her maiden name was Pentucevic, but she later married Mark Block, and yes, her name was Zana Block.
Kelly
she beat
White.
Marion Jones at the World Championships, by the way, in 2001.
Oh, how interesting. Two of your own people. So Kelly White. And then hammer thrower, John McEwen. Shot putters, Kevin Toth, CJ Hunter. Middle distance runners, Regina Jacobs. Boxer, Sugar Shane Mosely. And cyclist, Tammy Thomas. Is that right? Am I missing anyone?
Well, there's a lot more than that.
Oh.
I didn't work for Tammy Thomas. She worked directly with Patrick Arnold.
Okay.
I never had any contact with her or didn't help her. But yes, I did work with a lot of athletes that set world records and won Olympic gold medals. And everybody knows Barry Bonds is the all-time home run hitter, as well as the single season home run record at 73. And many consider him to be one of the greatest baseball players ever to live.
You've stated that you did not give anything to Barry Bonds. You weren't the one that allegedly injected or put the eyedropper in. Is that true?
Well, what I've said is I never even had a conversation with Barry Bonds about drugs, let alone gave him drugs.
Okay.
And if you put that into perspective, back then, when he hit this record in 2001, there was no drug testing in baseball, period. So the drugs that I was giving to Marion Jones and others, these athletes were subjected to the so-called gold standard of Olympic caliber drug testing at the time. So we were ducking and dodging and circumventing and playing that game, cat and mouse game, as they call it. But Barry didn't have to do any testing. So why would you want something like the Clear, a diluted version, which you would call baby food, when you can have a steak?
Yeah.
And you can inject and take all the hardcore testosterone or whatever drugs that you want to take. So Barry didn't need me. I did blood tests for him. I provided supplements to him. I helped him. I tested his father and his brother and became close to him in that regard. But that was one of those things that he and I never had those discussions, because he could do whatever he chose to do and didn't have to worry about testing. And my forte was helping people circumvent the Olympic caliber drug testing.
Marion Jones, she sued you for $25 million, saying that she did not, you're a liar, and that just magically went away. That's a big lawsuit.
You have to understand that these athletes at that time, she had a contract with American Express, with General Motors, with Nike. I mean, she was all over television. She was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. She was on the cover of Vogue magazine. So she was making a lot of money. So it's more the lawyers than it is the actual athletes. I never had any problem with Marion. But when they would come out and say, this guy's a liar, this guy, she didn't do any of this stuff, and blah, 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 I never talked about anybody. They brought in 40 athletes to testify before the BALCO grand jury against me. And I had not talked about anybody until they started talking and telling lies about me. And then when that happened, then of course I decided I have the right to tell the truth. This is not what happened. And of course, Marion and I had sat face to face, and I taught her how to inject growth hormone, and she put it right into her leg with me watching her in a hotel room down in Walnut, California at the Mount Sac Relays. So when I watched her on ESPN say, I'll tell you about this young lady right here, I have never taken any sort of, I'm like, oh my God, this is Academy Award winning acting is what this is. But I still hold nothing against her. I believe that every single one of the girls that was in that 100-meter race against her in Sydney was also using performance-enhancing substances. There's a level playing field. It may just not be the one that everyone thinks it is.
Yeah,
that's the tough part. And then the thing with Mosely, I never said anything about Shane Mosely whatsoever until he fought Cotto at Madison Square Garden. And he came out, this is years after the raid. I don't know what year that fight was, but the raid was in 2003. So for like 4 years, I never said anything. Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, that guy Conte, yeah, he duped me. He told me he was giving me vitamins and he gave me something else. New York Daily News, New York Times saying, he said that you duped him, that you tricked him, that you misled him. And the only thing I said was, Shane Mosely knew exactly and precisely what he was taking. Now, that's the only thing I said. And 4 days later, a $12 million
lawsuit
defamation case was filed. So between the two of them, Marion and Shane, that's $37 million worth of frivolous, fraudulent lawsuits that ultimately were both voluntarily dismissed, which means that I'm 2-0 with 2 knockouts. How you like it?
This thing with steroids, I mean, because it's an ongoing issue in all sports. It's not even just boxing. It's golf, tennis, baseball, cycling, probably darts soon. I don't even know.